We come today to Symbols 1. And this is a very difficult threshold because we're ready, finally, to approach the mind, to come to thought. And our age, for the last 300 years, has been overdeveloped in terms of the symbolic mind. And as a result, almost all of the other functions that we have in our capacity have been leached to such an extent that some of them are actually dry. There's hardly any insight that is employed in life currently. It is all co-opted by a pre-digested ideational thought. And so we've taken our time to come to symbols. We've given ourselves a chance to go through 3 phases of development. And those 3 phases of development are a basic recapitulation of how we got to the mind in the first place, of how thought developed in the first place. We started with nature because that's the only process that allows us a movement which is consistently real. And we followed 12 presentations on nature with 12 presentations on ritual, because it is the ritual comportment in selected actions that give us the little vignettes that link together and establish objectivity. And not just that we establish objectivity by our ritual actions arranged into sets, but that the universe itself establishes existence by that same process of form emerging out of nature. And it's as simple as space, the 3 dimensions of space, emerging out of time. As soon as time as a process occurs, space blossoms out of it. And so in a very real way, time is the first dimension. But time itself has a context out of which it occurs. And that context, we use the Chinese term Tao. We also use the mathematical designation 0. And it's not out of a 0 point, but it is out of a 0 non-point that 1 occurs, and that 1 initially is not a 1 that is objective, but a 1 that is the beginning of a time process, temporal process. And so we followed 12 presentations on nature with 12 presentations on ritual, and then put in a 3rd presentation series on myth, and showed that as nature is a process and rituals are objective forms, they establish objectivity in form, stable form. It's as if the dynamic in a process suddenly gets stabilized so that energy now creates matter, the stability of material form, existence. But the stability is not a static establishment, but continually emerges. And the normal English word for that is iteration. In yoga, as in advanced physics, the word is vibration. That the universe is not statically there, but is vibratorially there. That atoms occur because of a iterative vibration that is so swift in terms of its time rhythm that it seems to us that there's no movement at all. And yet we can understand. The mathematics has been available for more than 100 years. That the iterative function of emergence into existence happens in a pair of ways. One is an electromagnetic way, which is establishing the regular universe that we see. But at the same time, there is a complement to it, which is the magnetoelectric universe that functions at 10 to the 9th iterative energy. That's 10 billion times. So that something in the magnetoelectric universe could walk through the electromagnetic universe and never touch a thing. The space between electrons magnified 10 billion times, you could drive a whole star system, a whole galaxy in the magnetoelectric universe in between two electrons. So that we are actually in a reality that has a rather magical quality to it, and many levels and many dimensions. And so when the mythic process of experience comes into play, we found that it parallels nature. It likes to participate with nature and finds that its flow is not so much coherent, but that it is participatory and is willing to merge itself with the natural process. And so one of the qualities of experience is that feeling and images and language in their flow, in the flow of experience, works seamlessly when we are absorbed into it. When we are absorbed into the storyline. When we become absorbed into the story so that we are flowed along with the story, then the process of myth, the process of experience, indeed flows with nature. And as they flow together, that objectivity in between them acquires a naturalness, so that there is a naturalness to form, a naturalness to existence. But just as existence comes out of the natural process, something comes out of the process of mythic experience, and that is the mind. And the mind, again, is an objectivity. Thought is as objective as existentials. And once ideas are formed, they are like the quality of existentials. They are always there. And their effect continues to reverberate in the universe. Hence the old wisdom saying, it behooves us to think kind thoughts because those vibrations are permanent. The record of them is permanent. We come today to Symbols 1, where we're looking at the way in which symbolic thought emerges and the mind as a form emerges out of experience. And in order to do this, we need to give ourselves not just one, but a pair of stories that have a seamless mythic flow of feelings, of images, of language, as best we can discover in the heritage of the world's treasures. And I've chosen 2 novels to give us that introduction to the mind, that introduction to the forming by symbolic thought of the structure of ideas, the forms of mind. And one of them is by a woman and one of them is by a man, so that we have a gender balance. The woman is Virginia Woolf and the man is William Faulkner. And they form a rather interesting pair. Faulkner, from a little tiny spot in northern Mississippi, Oxford, Mississippi, was a small town boy who loved the vast forest wildernesses, and one of the greatest loves of his life was being able to hunt when he got of age. Usually it's about 12 years of age in the old American heritage. Boys who became 12 were given a gun and taught to hunt. I myself was taught at 12 to hunt with the family deer rifle with the ramrod that had been in the family for several hundred years. I remember trying to raise it and to shoot it, and because I was a little boy at 12, it knocked me down. And my mother refused to have me get a deer rifle, and so they purchased for me a little 20-gauge shotgun. And they sawed the butt off and put a little rubber piece so it was like a toy gun. And when I was taken hunting for the first time, pheasant hunting, they wouldn't let me go on a deer hunt like Faulkner loved. I remember my father and uncles and all the men trying to bring down a pheasant, and it was flying in such a beautiful pattern that all of them missed. And when it was about a city block away, I raised my toy rifle and in one shot brought it down. Pure luck, probably. But I gained a reputation as being a great hunter, and my mother refused to let me go any further, afraid that I would become a great hunter and would cause some serious damage. Faulkner was the kind of individual, when he was 12, he was taken to what he calls the big woods. And there, the men went through a ritual of opening up a case of scotch and getting completely drunk before they went on their first hunt to get rid of civilization, to get rid of the tang of the clingy home life, and to get back into the pure male hunting woods. Because what they were going after was not pheasant and not deer, but the biggest animal in the American forest, and that is bear, going after bear. And if you ever have gone on a bear hunt, you know that you have to be extraordinarily cautious. I remember a hitman for the Chicago Mafia family telling me about how he went on a bear hunt up on Kodiak Island and the Alaskan Aleutians. And they were professional hitmen. And two of his buddies were on ridges of this ravine, and he was on the floor of the ravine. And they knew guns since they were boys. They were crack shots. They had high-powered rifles. And he said one of his friends on the ridge yelled down to him to stop, stop, the bear is right there. And he said, I looked and I looked. He said, I couldn't see a bear. And suddenly, a boulder in front of him stood up. It was a Kodiak bear, was 11 feet tall on its back legs. And he said that he crapped his pants, a professional hitman. He said it was so fierce, that it was so terrific, that you realized that you had been taken out of every context where you were capable, and you were put into a realm where reality was suddenly overwhelming to you. And that existence had demanded that you're in its story, it's not in your story. This was something that writers like Faulkner and Virginia Woolf understood. But whereas Faulkner understood it from a male hunting in the big woods way, Virginia Woolf understood it in a completely cityfied way. She didn't come from a little town. She came from London, England. And she came out of a family that had been involved for centuries in being clergymen, in being ministers, in being parsons. A heavily Anglican religious traditional family, but her father was the bad boy of the family. He was an atheist. In fact, I brought one of his books called An Agnostic's Apology, because her father was Sir Leslie Stephen. And Sir Leslie Stephen was not only one of the great literary critics of England, but he was one of the two original editors for a series of books as large as the Oxford English Dictionary And it was called the Dictionary of National Biography, the DNB, that runs now to about 30 volumes. And it has the biographies of everyone of importance who has ever lived in England or in the British Empire, because many of the people in the DNB served in various parts of the world, India, Australia, Canada, everywhere that the British Empire spread. And so when Virginia Woolf was born in 1882, her father was one of the most important men in the whole strategy of keeping the British Empire in its tradition. Because if you know that you can look up the biographies of anyone, and this is going to be a permanent record, you're very careful not to break any of the rules. To keep in the tradition, to keep in the lineage, to keep the empire, to serve the empire, and not to be so individual that you are not going to be remembered that you fit in and you helped pull your load. But Virginia Woolf, being born into this kind of a literate, urban tradition at the very top, was a very special child. And she had a great deal of difficulty because when she was very young and sensitive and tender, her mother died. She was 13. And in being comforted, one of her half-brothers who had somewhat molested her since she was 6 raped her. And as a result, Virginia Woolf had a mental breakdown and was unable to address anything in any kind of a direct way. She couldn't stand to meet strangers face to face. If anyone talked to her, she would just blush scarlet and she would go into a frozen state. And those around her remembered that she had never spoken until she was over 3 years old. And they worried about her as a baby, as a young child, that there was something perhaps wrong with her because she couldn't speak. She didn't speak. Virginia Woolf lived in such a vast interior flow world that when it was crumbled and crunched on the outside, she went into a chaotic drift on the inside, and that chaotic drift was very, very, very close, if not identical, with madness. And eventually she was able to come out of that and come back into the world. But she carried for the rest of her life a fearful terror that madness was permanently lurking in her, and that the only way that she could deal with it was to keep contact with that chaotic flow within her. And so her writings more and more began to take 2 distinct forms. One, the traditional learned British organized form of like the essay, and the other was to write novels in a stream of consciousness flow. And one of the greatest novels of all time we're taking is her 1927 stream of consciousness novel, To the Lighthouse. But we're pairing it because we're not interested in traditional education at all. We're not interested in subjects. We're not interested in that kind of education that was rote and tests and grades and assignments for phony doctrines. We're interested as multidimensional beings achieving a maturity that is able to be opened and developed indefinitely. We want to have complete freedom. We want to have complete openness. But we also want to have the ability to come into whatever forms we deem useful and necessary to continue this. And so our learning has 2 different modes. One is to learn how to make forms so that they're real. And the other is to let processes occur so that they are real. To try to put processes within forms is the very essence of tyranny. And to try to dissolve forms that have come into existence back into a process is an arrogance. And so we are constantly taking ourselves in a way so that we pair up almost everything that we do. And the taproot of that pairedness is a 0-1 binary mode of complementarity. And those of you who are familiar with computers understand that if you have enough iterations of 0 and 1, you can write any form in any process that you could imagine. The latest supercomputer that's being made now, be operational in a few months, is able to do 25 trillion computations per second. 25 terabytes. Our minds have a capacity that's about 6,000 times that. So that we are beings that have a capacity for enormity, which is almost untapped. Our ability to form ideas in our minds is still on the primitive Neolithic level. We're still living in Neolithic village societies. And yet a great deal of our capacity has already gone out beyond the planet into the entire star system. And one of the questions that comes up, what is the context for your life? If the context for your life is the social registry of your own personal London, or the cultural requirements of your own hunting expedition in nature, then you're living on a village level. You're still back to where people are grubbing for roots and hoping to find berries in season, or trying to bring some game home so that you can roast it. We live in a context where when we go outside of our planet, we become aware that it's not only that there are other planets and other moons, but that the context for our star system as a whole are 2 trillion star systems making up an island universe called the Milky Way galaxy, and that is just a part of a local group of about 20 galaxies, and that there are family groups of these kinds of galactic clusters all over the place, and it extends out some 14 billion light years. So that when you're out in space, the very first realization is that the wilderness that we are in is a cosmos that is as far as light could travel at its own speed in 14 billion years. This is the really big woods. This is the really big city. And so we have a learning, I call it this cycle interstellar learning. It's to acclimate us to a different dimension of maturation. But it takes a while to deacclimate yourself from wherever it was that you were, and to introduce you progressively to the wider expansions until you gain the quality. In ancient wisdom, they used to call it the soul gaining its wings so that it's able to fly. And when it does, it flies freely. It has no bounds. It has only its own freedom. So context for William Faulkner was the big woods for hunting, but the context of nature for Virginia Woolf were summer vacations away from London. going to a place called St. Ives that's down on the Cornwall coast. England shaped like a kind of a squat eye, and on the farthest point of the lower point is the Shire of Cornwall, and on the very end of Cornwall, it's called Land's End, and there's a lighthouse on Land's End. So that if you came across the Atlantic Ocean after 3,000 miles, the first thing that you would see is the glow and the periodicity of the beacon of Land's End Lighthouse. But in order to allow for navigation, there had to be 2 points, not just one. And so on the south of Cornwall, there's another lighthouse that's a little bit further down near the little city of Penzance. The Gilbert and Sullivan comic opera, The Pirates of Penzance. But on the northern part of Cornwall, the lighthouse there is right on the edge of St. Ives Bay. So that where Virginia Woolf went as a child, all the time, her only experience of nature, of the wild, of wilderness, was going to St. Ives and looking across the Bay of St. Ives at the lighthouse there, which was for her the beacon of the other shore. And she never got to go there. And so her novel, To the Lighthouse, written when she was 45 years old, looking back and realizing that one must have a way to actually go to that portal of the unknown context of nature, and that you must actually go there. You must do this. And not just imagine to yourself in your mind that you will someday do this, or that, oh yes, well somebody did this, and then use their experience for your life. Other than St. Ives and that kind of wilderness, the only other thing she was ever exposed to growing up were the gardens in London, especially Kensington Garden. And when she was older, she found that the most interesting garden in England, where all the rare plants from all over the world were brought and planted so that it was one of the world's greatest gardens, was Kew Gardens. And she wrote a little book called Kew Gardens. She wrote it in 1919 when she was 37 years old, but she republished it when To the Lighthouse was brought out in 1927. They put out a new edition. And the publisher was herself and her husband. Another kind of a Leslie Stephen, only her husband, Leonard Woolf, was not involved in the DNB, but he was one of the greatest literary critics in England. And he was one of the few people that she could feel companionable with, because he had his own particular kind of insanity. He was interested constantly in making sure that the interchange of literature and life was permeable, so that literary works would be of reality in people's lives and not just some kind of intellectual projection. And so literature had to be real. It had to be real in a way that painting sometimes is real. There's a famous photograph of Marc Chagall when he had become one of the world's great painters, and he was commissioned to do one of the largest paintings on the planet. He was commissioned to repaint the ceiling of the Paris Opera, the entire dome. And so Chagall worked on this in an enormous studio. The wedges of it were 60 feet tall, so that when you put it all together, you would have a span of about 120 feet. And in order to make sure that the colors were real, Chagall would hold his own hand up to the colors to make sure they were alive, because he was a Hasid. is a mistake. And if the colors were not alive, if they didn't glow with life, then he would redo the entire panel. And so today, the great mandala that's on the inside of the dome of the Paris Opera is one of the great triumphant artworks of all time. Living color. In Kew Gardens, Virginia Woolf, for the very first time, takes on the way in which a living language would occur in experience, not in her experience as the writer writing it down, but that it would occur from her consciousness, which is another process, and would come directly through the other person's mind and register in their experience. So that the reader's experience would have the real experience, the real images, the real feeling, not some kind of an imitation of what the artist had in their mind. That if the artist wrote from their mind, that's what would happen, and does happen. And mainly is the reason why most people consider that images are representations of something that is real in the mind, and therefore the world must just be something that's there because the mind makes it there. Whereas if you write not from symbols, but from the higher level, and the higher level is another process called consciousness. We call it vision. Vision is a much more useful term than just consciousness. But if you write from consciousness, then the experience is not just absorbed in nature, but is absorbed at the same time in consciousness. So that experience now is not just natural, but is also conscious, and will have not the 4 dimensions of nature, but the 5 dimensions of conscious nature. And when you have a 5-dimensional flow, that kind of a process, the 4-dimensional experience will always then have a quality of mysteriousness in its very realistic sense of time-space. It will no longer be just time-space, but it will be a time-space that could, at any moment, open into a quintessential, universal realization. And the word for this is taken from the Greek. It's epiphany. Epiphany. An epiphany is a moment of eternity in the experience of someone who's been exposed to a 5-dimensional quality as well as the natural quality of experience. And we'll find that Virginia Woolf and William Faulkner are 2 of the greatest writers of all time. They were both able to do this. Faulkner put his emphasis on nature with a little bit of conscious complement, whereas Virginia Woolf put her large emphasis on consciousness with a little bit of nature. It's like the relationship of electric to magnetic. They are always together. But in the electromagnetic spectrum, the big moment, as it's called, the big dynamic, is the electrical part, with the magnetic being small. Whereas the complement to it is where the magnetic moment is huge and the electric is small. They're complements in the sense that they can exchange with each other seamlessly. And this is one of the great wisdom realizations of our kind. It isn't just that 2 are resolved into 1. It's that 1 and 0 exchange with each other seamlessly. So the Zen saying is, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. If they flow seamlessly, then the complementarity of the 2 will be a set of the real. And if you proportion, if you ratio in the real, whatever is proportioned, whatever is ratioed, will likewise be real. And if one has an understanding of yourself or someone else with realistic proportions, with ratios of the real, they will indeed not just be real in the real, but they will be real in this world as well. To you, and because they will have been seen by someone who is real to themselves. And in this way, human beings and their exchange between each other, when they achieve these moments of reality together, because they are real, really, it is permanent. It's an eternal moment. This is what is called salvation. Not that you believe a doctrine, but that together we have established our reality. This is called community of the blessed. It is time for this planet to get real and for the community to extend to everyone who can hear. We're going to take a break, but I want to give you a couple of the paragraphs of Kew Gardens. Notice the symbolic tone tends not to establish meaning because it's a representation of something, but establishes meaning because the feeling, image, language is transparent. From the oval-shaped flower bed, there rose perhaps 100 stalks spreading into heart-shaped or tongue-shaped leaves halfway up and unfurling at the tip, red or blue or yellow petals marked with spots of color raised upon the surface. And from the red, blue, or yellow gloom of the throat emerged a straight bar, rough with gold dust and slightly clubbed at the end. The petals were voluminous enough to be stirred by the summer breeze, and when they moved, the red, blue, and yellow lights passed one over the other, staining an inch of the brown earth beneath with a spot of the most intricate colors. The light fell either upon the smooth gray back of a pebble or the shell of a snail with its brown circular veins, or falling in a raindrop, it expanded with such intensity of red, blue, and yellow, the thin walls of water, that one expected them to burst and disappear. Instead, the drop was left in a second silver gray once more, and the light now settled upon the flesh of a leaf, revealing the branching thread of fiber beneath the surface. And again, it moved on and spread its illumination in the vast green spaces beneath the dome of the heart-shaped and tongue-shaped leaves. Then the breeze stirred rather more briskly overhead, and the color was flashed into the air above, into the eyes of men and women who walk these Kew Gardens this July. Let's take a break. Let's come back to form and background. While the background is sometimes a form, the best background for the most complex forms is a process. So that the definition is not a form in terms of its referent, but in terms of its positional possibilities within a field. The landscape is the classic way in which the life of an individual is seen. And this, let them in. This landscape sometimes is an urban landscape, sometimes a nature, a wilderness. One of the biggest difficulties is to come to understand that the mind by itself is not able to assess the true dimensions. And so a language that builds itself in terms of the mind is traditionally called a rhetoric. You can bring them in now. Very good. A rhetoric builds its structure so that it is comprehensible to the mind. But there is a different style of structure and language called a poetic. And a poetic has for its structure a different quality, and that is of a differential form called the person. And so the personal is a higher form than the individual. The individual is a form that symbolically has objectivity in the mind. And the individual as a form symbolic in the mind, the me, is based on a quality of experience, and that quality of experience is called character, one's character. Even little babies will show their character before there's any individuality. Even animals will have a character, and one gets to know. Even plants will have their own character. I learned to meditate in the Sierra Nevada mountains as a teenager, and so my sangha were the giant sequoia trees, and got to know not only individual trees as they were, but got to know the entire forest. And when I got more mature, I could sense the entire Sierra Nevada, about 500 miles of mountains, as a single locale, the backbone, the spine of California. I learned language as a poetic in that context, and I thought I would give you just a few lines so that you can understand that I've been doing this on a very high level for a long time. This is from a long poem called Sequoia Matrix Sutra, and just a few lines. Wandering together on vague Sierra paths, dramatic parapets bleak amid canyon dimensions, far above the plunge, clear water. Outer edges, greens and granite. Tarry a moment, those windy places, those long moments, bent, stooped in the rushing updraft, fluttering hoods, ever hooded with hickory staff, anomalies. 20th century being in the world way out there in September Sierras. And we, gnarled and weathered, ever quiet. Ancient pines rooted in sheer granite. Hokusai, vigilance and vistas and visions, dynamic history. That primordial push that tears up and walks with big steps or makes us attentive in passionate apprehension, listening in on ourselves and our privilege. It is now time to open the sealed orders. We have been writing them for 14,000 years. O thrice greatest Hermes, you are my blood and my nerves. Confirm my reality among the stars. Go outward bound and be, so that I am to be, and you are, and we will have been before and since. I wrote that at 19, 45 years ago. Now, there are many books on poetry. This is one of the most famous, Poetic Diction, A Study in Meaning, Owen Barfield. A poetic diction is different from a rhetorical diction. A rhetorical diction makes everything ordered so that your mind will understand. a poetic diction opens out the differential array of possibilities so that your person will be free. And so poetry frees. Whereas rhetoric styles so that the objectivity will be clear in the mind, but that's no guarantee that it's real in the conscious spread of the world and of your more large majority. And so this is a kind of a learning that brings us all the way through the mind into the larger expanses beyond it. And the mind allows itself to do this because the mind, when it becomes permeated by consciousness, learns that it has a very special gift, that at the center of its imagery coming together, at the center of feeling weaving together, at the center where language becomes objectively clear in ideas, that juncture is able to undergo a change called a transformation. And when that transformation happens, the center of images and feeling, which is called the imagination, goes out of the mind and goes into the flow of consciousness. So that consciousness transforms the imagination into what is traditionally called creative imagination. And out of creative imagination will come art, works of art. And the person, the spiritual person, is a work of art, not an individual. But because the exchange and interchange is universal, when the imagination goes out of the mind and participates in the flow of the process of consciousness, a quality in consciousness goes into the mind. The quality in consciousness that goes into the mind is memory, and when it goes into the mind, it's no longer the process of conscious memory, but becomes the memory. And for the first time, the objective mind gains the form of the memory. And it's the memory that works as an operator to transform all the rest of the cycle of integration. So that now one doesn't just have experience, one has qualities of experience that one could call experiment. You could try some what-ifs, some experiments with your facility for experience and come to investigate and learn and find out all kinds of different angles so that understanding now is not just clear, but it's jewel-like. It has the scintillation of many, many capacities, including machines that are undisciplined. We can work them in. And we have to in our world because we live in something that is so layered in its chaoticness that the only thing that one can do with it is to have high wisdom. Because if you run a chaos fast enough, complex enough, it will show the double attractor butterfly effect of like an infinity sign that blinks into existence all by itself. Chaos run fast enough transforms itself into the establishment of a particular butterfly effect. It is this butterfly effect that is the ancient Paleolithic technique for hunting. 50,000 years ago, before there was anything like the mind that we have today, or maps, or ordination, hunters had to find where they were, not in terms of a place, but in terms of the landscape wherein the game was wild. And one had to be able to ordinate in terms of the actual landscape that's there. And the ancient hunting technique is this: no matter where you are, if you make a sachet to the left and come back to where you were, and then make a sashay to the right and come back to where you were. And you continue to do this by going out a little further each time and coming back. Wherever it is that you are becomes the exchange pivot that gives you a sense of the wilderness in terms of its wildness. And within that, one begins to notice that game always has a pattern of its life cycle within that. And the pattern will illuminate itself for you because you will have explored the wilderness in terms of its wildness, and the game in its pattern of life will show you its culture of life cycle, lifestyle. All animals, even all plants, have a life cycle that's very distinctive. It's like their signature. Deer always move in a deer-like way, and they always have their little paths in deer paths, and one can learn to follow something like a deer path. The early American hunters 300 years ago found their way because there were no roads, but they found their way by going along not just the rivers, but the deer paths through the woods. So that James Fenimore Cooper's last great novel was about the earliest Europeans who became white Indians, and the name of that novel is called The Deer Slayer. And the deer slayer at the beginning of the novel is running full blast through the wilderness, chuckling silently to himself. Is a sense of humor, but he knows you can't laugh out loud, you'll scare the game. But he runs like a deer with the same motion as a deer. And a hunter can learn, and not just a hunter who's out there to kill the deer, but a hunter of being real can learn to do this. I learned to run like a deer, not only in the daytime, but in the nighttime, where there are no paths in the Sierra. I remember when my daughter was 4, taking her to Crescent Meadow in Sequoia National Park and teaching her how to walk deer-like. And we got just past an ancient fallen sequoia tree where the first white man in that part of the Sierra Nevada, Hale Tharp, lived. And it's called Tharp's Log. And we were just passing it and learning to walk like deer when out of the Crescent Meadow came a doe and her fawn and walked within about 10 feet of us and on up the ridge. And my 4-year-old daughter, grinning with little dolphin teeth, said, "Dad, they think we're deer." And I said, "We are deer." We belong here like they do. We belong here with them. Faulkner, when he was taken out to the woods, had a figure with him who was usually the cook in camp or the guide to get them there. And his name was Sam Fathers. He was half black and he was half Indian, Choctaw Indian and half African black. And Sam Fathers took Faulkner aside and said to him, "If you only come to the woods to drink and kill, you will never be at home in nature. You must learn to be here like the bear is here." Now, Faulkner was able to hear him because he was not really raised by his mother. He was raised by a black woman named Caroline Barr that he always called Mammy. She lived to be 100. And his beautiful volume, Go Down Moses, is dedicated to Mammy Caroline Barr, who was born in slavery and who gave to my family a fidelity without stint or calculation of recompense, and to my childhood an immeasurable devotion and love. She taught him how to be real. And in Go Down Moses, the name Go Down Moses is from a Southern song. Go down, Moses, to the promised land. Tell, O Pharaoh, let my people go. In Go Down, Moses, there's a section called The Bear. And it's Faulkner's way of expressing that he had learned the Paleolithic wisdom of how to be real in nature and not just how to hunt. And The Bear is one of the world's great stories. It's about 60, 70 pages long. And he says in here, in The Bear, that this young boy of 17 trying to learn to drink and to kill with the rest of the men, and Sam Fathers had told him that you have to be able to go into the woods and set down the 3 coordinates that make you superior and abstract you from reality. One is your watch, the other is your compass, and the third is your gun. And if you set these down and just commit yourself to the big woods, you will have an experience of initiation, inviting you to participate so that your experience flows in nature seamlessly. And so he does in The Bear. And this boy sets it down, and as soon as he does, he notices a footprint in the wet, moist loam of the forest floor. In northern Mississippi, the forests are white pine. And he notices that this footprint is a bear paw print, but it has a certain kind of a bent quality to one of the claws, and this is the oldest bear in the forest who was injured, who knows, generation or two ago. And so he begins just following that bear paw trail, and he notices that finally he sees a bear paw print where the moisture is just beginning to seep up, that the print was just made. And he looks up, and in the tapestry of the big woods, he is able for the first time to discern that the bear is looking at him, the old bear. And he says the old bear, looking at him, caused no fear in him. And the bear didn't turn and go away, but he says, like a big old fish in a very cloudy pool, the bear was reabsorbed by the forest. And as soon as it was, he said he turned around and there was his watch, his compass, and his gun where he had left them. The bear had brought him exactly back to that point where he had started. And he realized that he had not come full circle, but he had come to the focus of an infinity sign, of a double attractor, and that he now understood that he had been accepted by the bear, who was the master of the forest, that was a part of the real of nature. And for the first time, Faulkner realized that he was not just real because he was William C. Faulkner, son of so-and-so, but that he was a spirit who was real in the universe. And so all of his books after that became something different. One of the great tribes of people on the planet who came to love Faulkner because they themselves had this relationship to nature, but had it in kind of an abstracted way, a super Virginia Woolf way, and that was the Japanese. That the Japanese of the late 20th century had become so sophisticated that there were hardly any places that were wild anymore except just the little Zen gardens and monasteries. And so the Japanese became great aficionados of Faulkner. And some of the most popular of all of the journals on William Faulkner studies are published in Japan. This is from my friend, the editor of the William Faulkner Materials Studies and Criticism. It's a letter to me from 1982, dedicated to me. Faulkner hated to go into the public, and only one time in his life went outside the country to lecture, and that was to Japan. He went to Nagano, which is a literate university town in northern Japan, and he gave a series of interviews and talks in Nagano. The only other time was at the end of his life when he was invited by the University of Virginia to go and deliver some lectures and some interviews there. He went there because the University of Virginia had been built by Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson designed the curriculum. He was the architect for all the buildings. He built the library with his own books and things. And so Faulkner went there because Faulkner's literary land is called Jefferson County, Mississippi. And in Jefferson County, one of the qualities is that Faulkner, by late 1929, came to understand, like Virginia Woolf had done about the same time, that literature must be real. The way Faulkner said it at the University of Virginia one time, he said, "I learned finally that characters can cast shadows if they have enough dimensions. And the shadows that they cast are that they become individuals in the mind of the reader. And if they become individuals in the mind of the reader, they are objectively real in the reader and not just in my mind, but in the reader's mind." This is an ancient wisdom technique. If one speaks in a poetic, the objectivity registers in the hearer, not in the speaker. So that the hearer has it fresh, has it immediately real. And because it's immediately real iteratively, it means it will be permanently alive there. And a mind that has anything permanently alive is on its way to being permanently alive forever. There's no death for that, ever. One can always come back, and come back with that. That's why there's a reincarnation. That's why there are past lives. That's why there are future lives. Without end. World without end. And so this kind of a learning is a maturity not to get grades or degrees or a job, but to become real permanently. This is how As I Lay Dying, one of his earliest stream of consciousness novels, begins. There's no narrator other than the characters of the figures in the story. And the first figure, Darrell, is one of the sons, and he's the one who is institutionalized because he is too sensitive, like Virginia Woolf, who was too sensitive. And Virginia Woolf had a half-sister, Laura, that finally had to be institutionalized. She just couldn't cope with the world. And Darrell is this figure in As I Lay Dying. And he's talking from his stream of consciousness about two of his brothers that he sees walking across a field. And in this field, there is a square building that's at the center of the field. The field is the cultivated crop culture of the rural South, and the house is abandoned, and it has a big square blank window on each of two sides and a little door. And the first brother is named Jewel, who is so resentful of the world that he is like a stiff automaton, and he only does what he needs to do ritually. And the other brother is named Cash, and he is the carpenter. And they're on their way home because their mother is dying. And in the course of the book, it's all about the different relations of these different people to the mother dying, because she was the only thing that kept that family together. She was the only real person in that family. Everyone else was like a reaction version of trying to relate to her, and she's the only one who was real, and she's dying. Jewel and I come up from the field following the path in single file. Although I am 15 feet ahead of him, anyone watching us from the cotton house can see Jewel's frayed and broken straw hat a full head above my own. The path runs straight as a plumb line. worn smooth by feet and baked brick hard by July, between the green rows of laid-by cotton, to the cotton house in the center of the field, where it turns and circles, the cotton house at 4 soft right angles and goes on across the field again, worn so by feet in fading precision. The cotton house is of rough logs, from between which the chinking has long since fallen. Square with a broken roof set at a single pitch, it leans in empty and shimmering dilapidation in the sunlight, a single broad window and 2 opposite walls giving on to the approaches of the path. When we reach it, I turn and follow the path which circles the house. Jewel, 15 feet behind me, looking straight ahead, steps in a single stride through the window. Staring straight ahead, his pale eyes like wood set in his wooden face. He crosses the floor in 4 strides with the rigid gravity of a cigar store Indian, dressed in patched overalls and endued with life from the hips down, and steps in a single stride through the opposite window and onto the path again, just as I come, around the corner. In single file and 5 feet apart, and Jewel now in front, we go on up the path towards the foot of the bluff. Tull's wagon stands beside the spring, hitched to the rail, the reins wrapped about the seat stanchion. In the wagon bed are 2 chairs. Jewel stops at the spring and takes the gourd from the willow branch and drinks. I pass him and mount the path, beginning to hear Cash's saw. When I reach the top, he has quit sawing. Standing in a litter of chips, he is fitting 2 boards together. Between the shadow spaces, they are yellow as gold, like soft gold, bearing on their flanks in smooth undulations the marks of the adze blade. A good carpenter, Cash is. He holds the 2 planks on the trestle, fitted along the edges in a quarter of the finished box. He kneels and squints along the edge of them and then lowers them and takes up the adze. A good carpenter. Addie Bundren could not want a better one, a better box to lie in. It will give her confidence and comfort. I go to the house, followed by the chuck, chuck, chuck of the adze. The reason that writers like Faulkner and Virginia Woolf and a few others like James Joyce and Marcel Proust were able to do this, because one of the greatest geniuses of all time had written the first textbook on psychology in the world. It's by William James. Published in 1890, this is the first edition of it. The Principles of Psychology is the first time in the world that there was ever a textbook on psychology of the entire range of the psyche and psychology of human beings, complete. And chapter sequence in here is kind of interesting. There is a whole section here of the methods and snares of psychology, and then a chapter 8 on the relation of minds to other things, and then the great chapter 9 is called The Stream of Thought. And it's in this chapter that William James, for the first time, is able to discursively disclose what the stream of thought really is, and it was called later in literature stream of consciousness. And what it actually is, that we can see now at the beginning of the 21st century, is the stream of experience that forms in the mind in such a way that it is an open frame and passes through the framed objectivity of the mind and flows so that experience flows free as consciousness, and where experience with 4-dimensional consciousness is 5. And so there's kind of like a natural backwash where consciousness comes back through the mind into experience, and experience becomes illumined. An illumined experience, when it is integrated into the mind, instead of it just being a normal frame, the framing becomes very ornate and very rare and very treasured. And so whatever that mind looks at becomes not framed in abstractness, but becomes given a square of attention, which has all the possibilities of transform. William James was able to do this because he had to endure one of the strangest childhoods and initiations as a young man that anyone had come into. William James had a very famous brother, Henry James, and Henry James is one of the most complex authors who ever lived. And when Virginia Woolf was first learning to really write well in 1919, her ideal was Henry James. She wrote a number of reviews of Henry James's work. But Henry James and William James had a sister, Alice James, and all three of them were force-fed by an intellectual genius father, Henry James Sr., who wanted nothing but genius children. And so when they were 2 and 3 years old, they were forced to learn Greek and Latin and the European languages and to read and do math. And Henry James Sr. wanted geniuses. And poor Alice James didn't survive it and spent most of her life in an institution cared for by her 2 brothers, one of which left the United States and hated to ever come back. Henry James went to England, went to Europe, and became an expatriate to such an extent that just before he died, he gave up his American citizenship. He didn't want anything more to do with a country that was increasingly mechanical and manipulated. This was in 1915. William James, on the other hand, both of them were raised on the Harvard campus in Massachusetts, across the Charles River from Boston. So that the world that they knew was Harvard University with all the great professors, all the great courses, and they were raised to be the creme de la creme in that. Except that as Henry wanted to escape through literature, through writing novels and stories, William was the practical one. He wanted to do an adventure that would get him out of Harvard, not just out of town, but out of the mentality of university America. And so when he found that one of the great professors at Harvard, named Louis Agassiz, was doing an expedition to the Amazon jungle, he prevailed to go along with the expedition. And when they got to Rio de Janeiro, right away, William James came down with an illness that was compounded by a mental breakdown, that was compounded by a spiritual crisis, and he spent several weeks in the hospital, and they were waiting just to send him home to ship him back to some hospital existence in Massachusetts. When he came out of the situation and he prevailed upon Agassiz to give him a special kind of assignment. While the rest of the expedition went along the Amazon in a big research ship, William James was given permission to go alone with just a native guide into the Amazon. And he spent 6 months alone with his guide doing scientific research and doing spiritual initiation for himself. And when he came out of the Amazon jungle, he was a completely changed human being and became not only the greatest philosopher of the 19th century, but became the world's first psychologist. And all the others, Jung, Freud, Adler, everybody studied William James first. The principles of psychology is the beginning of psychology as a science. But what got through William James to the world is that the farther reaches of psychology are called psychic research. And William James was the president of the Society for Psychic Research. He was the instigator that there is more to psychology that we don't know about than that we do. And he wrote 1,000 pages on it. But the center of it is the stream of thought And we're going to talk more about it next week, how thought all by itself, if given consciousness, tends to scintillate in a personal form. It's like a natural occurrence for it. That when you get a 5-dimensional conscious time-space, it tends to want to be a prismatic person rather than an individual. And that the clue for the prismatic individual is the transformation of the character out of one's experience. And so if the character is given a wild freedom in their own experience that flows with nature, the consciousness will deliver an artistic, spiritual person creatively, naturally, as it were, cosmically. Because what happens then is that the spiritual person, who is a differential form and not an integral form, has a natural affinity with the largest differential form that there is, and that's the cosmos. So that person and cosmos relate like mind and existence relates. But mind and existence align integrally, whereas person and cosmos vibrate harmonically. And so the spiritual person finds that their landscape is the cosmos as a whole. And they are free everywhere, on any dimension, wherever they happen to be. More next week.